Let us begin, not with a person or an event, but with a smell. Imagine you are in a room in the heart of Victorian London. The year is perhaps 1850. It is late. The street outside your window is quiet, but it is not still. You move to the window, the velvet curtain, heavy and thick in your hand. You check the latch. It is sealed tightly. You might even take a scrap of cloth and press it into the seam where the wooden frame meets the wall. You are not afraid of thieves. You are not afraid of the cold. You are afraid of the air itself. This fear has a name. It is the miasma. To the Victorian mind, this was not superstition. It was not a folk tale. It was science. It was observable fact. Sickness, they believed, was a physical thing, a poisonous vapor, a foul smell, a creeping pestilence that drifted on the wind. It was, quite literally, bad air. This bad air, this miasma, rose from anywhere there was rot, anywhere there was decay. It was the smell of the grave, the smell of the sewer, the smell of the swamp, given a form that could ride the breeze and slip beneath your door. And in a Victorian city, rot was everywhere. Let's walk through these streets in our minds. The fog, so famous in stories, is not a clean white mist. It is a pea souper, a thick, yellow, clinging soup. It is heavy with the smoke of a million coal chimneys, a black soot that stains your collar and coats your tongue. You can taste the iron and sulfur in it. But the fog was only a mask. Beneath it lay the true sources of the miasma. The streets are not clean. They are paved with filth. The constant ringing, clang of horseshoes on cobblestone is the soundtrack of the city. And with thousands of horses comes thousands of tons of manure. Every single day. This waste is not always cleaned up. It piles in the gutters. It mixes with the mud, the rain, the household garbage tossed from upper windows. Butchers throw scraps of blood and gristle right into the street. Tanners dump foul-smelling liquids. Fishmongers rinse their stalls with buckets of rank water. And all of it, all of this rot, bakes in the sun or freezes in the winter. It creates a constant, powerful smell. And then there is the river, the great River Thames. To the Victorian, the Thames was not a source of beauty. It was an open sewer. It was the city's toilet. For centuries, every cesspit, every drain, every factory pipe, every awful secret of the city emptied directly into its water. The river in the summer did not flow. It oozed. It was a thick, black, toxic stew. The water was warm to the touch. It bubbled with methane gas. In the hot summer months, the smell was unimaginable. In 1858, it became so bad they called it the Great Stink. Let's stay here for a moment. The heat is oppressive. The sun beats down on this river of poison, and the miasma, the smell, rises in a visible, putrid cloud. It is so strong, it seeps into the Houses of Parliament, right on the riverbank. The politicians, the lawmakers, gagged. They could not debate. They soaked their curtains in lime and chloride to mask the stench. They held perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces. This was not just an inconvenience. To them, it was an attack. They believed this wave of miasma, this breath of death, was rising from the river to claim them. This panic, this sensory assault, is what finally forced them to build the London sewer system. They were not motivated by a desire for cleanliness. They were motivated by terror. So you are back in your room. You understand why the window is sealed. The night air was considered the most dangerous. When the sun went down, the miasma was thought to grow stronger, heavier. The absence of sunlight allowed the rot to take over. This deadly air would seep through the streets, looking for a way in. To be safe, you must control the smell. A wealthy home would be filled with counter fragrances, bowls of dried flowers, lavender, rose petals, and rosemary. Servants might burn sweet-smelling resins or pastilles like incense. A lady walking through the streets would carry a vinaigrette, a small silver box filled with cotton or a sponge soaked in strong aromatic vinegar. When she passed a foul-smelling gutter or a sick person, she would lift it to her nose to breathe in the sharp, clean scent of vinegar and protect her lungs from the bad air. This fear shaped the very buildings of medicine. When Florence Nightingale, the famous nurse, spoke of hospitals, she spoke almost entirely of air. A hospital, she argued, must not have a hospital smell. That smell, that close, sour, sick smell, was miasma. It was the smell of death building up in the room. The cure was ventilation. New hospitals were built on the pavilion model. They were long, separate rectangular wards. They had massive, tall windows on both sides. They were designed to let the wind, the good air, blow through constantly, to dilute and disperse the miasma from the sick. They built hospitals on hills, away from the city, seeking clean air high above the rot. But if you were poor, you had no such defense. You lived inside the miasma. In the crowded slums, the rookeries, you shared a single unventilated room with perhaps 10 other people. The tannery, the slaughterhouse, the overflowing graveyard was right outside your broken window. For the poor, the air was a constant, suffocating reminder of their place. Disease was not a germ. It was the very atmosphere of poverty. And so the Victorian doctor began his work, armed with a wrong theory. A theory that was so close and yet so terribly, fatally wrong. They were half right.
Rotting things are connected to disease, but the smell was just a symptom, a warning sign. The real killer was invisible. It was in the water, not just the air. It was on the doctor's unwashed hands. It was in the breath of another human. But they did not know this, not yet. And so their entire medical philosophy was built on this fear of the air. If sickness was a foul, invisible poison that invaded the body, then the cure must be equally violent. The cure must force the miasma out. This was the thinking that led to the poison cabinet, to the surgical theater, to the heroic cures that we will soon explore.
The fear was palpable. A bad smell, a foul mist, could mean the end of your life. But what happened when the miasma seemed to get in? When the fever started, the cough, the weakness? Who, in this gaslit, foggy world, could you possibly call for? You did not simply go to the doctor. The world of Victorian medicine was a fractured landscape, a rigid class system of healers. To understand their medicine, you must first understand them. There were 3 men you might see: the physician, the surgeon, and the apothecary. And the man who arrived at your door depended entirely on your wealth. Let us first imagine you are rich. You live in a grand house. Your fever is high. Your family panics. They send a fast carriage to the finest street in London. They are summoning the physician. The physician is a gentleman. He is almost certainly a man. He attended Oxford or Cambridge. His education was not practical. He did not learn about anatomy or disease. He learned about theory. He spent years reading the ancient texts, Hippocrates and Galen. He read them in the original Latin and Greek. He believed deeply in the 4 humors, that your body was a balance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and your fever was simply an imbalance. When he arrives, he does not rush. He steps from his private carriage. He is immaculate, a silk top hat, a fine woolen suit. He carries a gold-topped cane. He is ushered into the sick room. The curtains are drawn. The room is still. And here the performance begins. The physician does not touch you. To touch a sick body was beneath him. It was a manual, dirty job. His work was intellectual. He will stand at a polite distance from your bed. He will observe. He will ask for a vial of your urine. He will hold this water up to the candlelight. He will study
its color, its sediment. He may wave it beneath his nose. He might even, though rarely, dip a single finger in and taste it, looking for the sugar sickness. He will listen to your family's description. He will lean closer, perhaps, to smell your breath. He will inspect your tongue. He is a detective of the humors. After a long, thoughtful pause, he will render his verdict. The blood is too hot, or there is an excess of phlegm. He will then sit at your desk, pull out a piece of fine paper, and with a fountain pen, write out a long, complex prescription. It will be in Latin, a secret code between him and the apothecary. It might list 20 different ingredients. Then he will collect his enormous fee, and he will be gone. He has done his job. He has thought about your illness. But what if your problem was not a fever? What if you had a broken leg, a painful tumor, a wound that would not heal? The physician would be horrified. He would not handle such things. For that, you needed a different man. You needed the surgeon.
If the physician was a gentleman, the surgeon was a tradesman, a craftsman. He was, for centuries, linked to the barbers. The man who cut your hair and shaved your beard was the same man who pulled your teeth, set your bones, and cut off your limbs. By the Victorian era, they were trying to become more respectable. But in the minds of the wealthy and the poor, the surgeon was a butcher. He did not go to university. He learned his trade as an apprentice. He learned by watching, by holding men down, by doing. If you could not afford a physician, the surgeon might be your only doctor. When he arrives, he does not look like the physician. He wears not fine silks, but a dark, heavy frock coat. It is stiff. It is filthy. It is covered in the dark, dried stains of all his previous patients. The surgeon did not wash his coat. He did not wash his hands. Why would he? The blood, the pus, the grime was a badge of honor. It was a symbol of his experience. It showed how busy he was, how many bodies he had opened. A clean coat would mean he had no patience. He would enter the room and he would touch you. His hands would be rough, his fingernails black. He would probe the wound, set the bone. He was a man of saws and knives and hooks and needles, and he would cause unimaginable pain. But for most people, for the vast middle class and the teeming poor. Both the physician and the surgeon were too expensive. If you were a shop girl, a factory worker, a mother in a crowded tenement, you went to the man on the corner.
You went to the apothecary. The apothecary was the people's healer. He was a shopkeeper. His education was also an apprenticeship. But his was a mastery of substances. Let's imagine his shop. You push open the door, a small bell jingles. The air is thick. It is a wall of smells, not the foul miasma of the street, but something different. The smell of dried herbs, camphor, lavender, licorice, opium. The smell of spices, cloves and cinnamon. The smell of chemicals, alcohol, ammonia, chlorine. The shop is dark, wooden shelves, floor to ceiling. Hundreds of glass jars filled with powders and liquids. Tiny wooden drawers with handwritten labels. On the counter, you see a large glass jar filled with dark, slimy water, and inside a writhing knot of leeches. The apothecary is the man who fills the physician's Latin prescriptions. He is the only one who can understand the codes. He grinds the powders, he mixes the potions. But he also does his own work. He is the neighborhood doctor. You tell him your troubles. Your baby is coughing. Your husband has a pain. He will listen, and he will mix something for you. A simple, cheap cure. He is part pharmacist, part doctor, and part poison seller. For in his shop he holds everything. He sells the mercury, the arsenic, the laudanum that we will soon come to fear. These were the three healers: the physician who thought but did not touch, the surgeon who cut but did not wash, the apothecary who mixed and sold both cure and poison. Three separate professions, divided by class and education, and yet they all shared one single, brutal belief. They all believed that medicine must be an attack, that the only way to cure a violent sickness was with a more violent intervention. This was the philosophy of heroic medicine, a philosophy that we will now explore. These three men, the physician, the surgeon, the apothecary, they were divided by class, by education, by their very function. And yet they were united by a single terrifying philosophy. It was known as heroic medicine. The name sounds noble, brave, as if the doctor was a hero rushing in to save a life. But its reality was brutal. It was not heroic for the doctor. It was heroic for the patient. It was a measure of how much the human body could endure. This philosophy was an assault. It was born from the lingering shadows of the ancient world. The physician, with his Latin texts, still believed deeply in the four humors, that your body was a delicate balance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. To be healthy was to be in balance. Sickness, therefore, was an imbalance. But the Victorians added their own layer of fear. The miasma, the foul air. Sickness was not a gentle drift. It was an invasion. A poison from the street, a vapor from the river had entered you. It was a violent force, a corrupting influence that threw your vital fluids into chaos. And the logic of heroic medicine was simple, and it was terrible. To fight a violent invasion, you could not be gentle. You could not wait. You could not coddle the disease. You had to attack it. You had to meet violence with greater violence. You had to expel the poison, to force the body back into balance by any means necessary. This belief gave birth to three great cures, the three pillars of heroic intervention: bleeding, purging, and sweating.
Let's think about the first, bleeding. To the Victorian doctor, it was the supreme remedy. If a patient had a fever, if their face was red, their pulse fast, their skin hot, the physician saw too much blood. The blood was hot, it was inflamed, it was carrying the poison. The cure was obvious. Let it out. The surgeon would be called. He would take a small, sharp blade called a lancet. He would find the vein in your arm, and he would cut. The blood, dark and warm, would flow into a ceramic bowl. They measured the blood in ounces. They would take 8 ounces, 10, 12. They would keep bleeding you until you fainted. This was the goal. The faint was called syncope. It was a sign that the body was reacting, that the pressure had been relieved. If you could not get a surgeon, the apothecary would provide the leeches, those dark, slimy creatures we saw in the jar. They would be placed on the skin, on the temples to cure a headache, on the chest to cure a lung fever. They would attach themselves and drink their fill of the bad blood. Even George Washington, in a slightly earlier time, was blooded of nearly 4 liters of blood in a single day for a throat infection. It was the infection that killed him, but the bleeding certainly hurried it along. That was the first pillar.
The second was purging. If the poison was not in the blood, perhaps it was in the stomach, in the bowels. It too must be expelled. This was the apothecary's domain. He would mix a powerful emetic, a drink so foul it would make you vomit violently for hours. Or he would mix a blistering purgative, a pill or powder that would empty your bowels completely. The most famous of these was a white powder called calomel. It was mercury chloride, a deadly heavy metal. The doctors loved it. They called it the hero's dose. They gave it for everything: constipation, fever, cholera, teething in babies. It caused massive cramping, explosive diarrhea, and it made you salivate, thick ropes of drool. To the heroic doctor, this was beautiful. It was proof the poison was leaving the body. Of course, it was just the body trying to expel the new poison, the mercury.
The third pillar was sweating. The skin was another way out. If you could force a patient to sweat profusely, the miasma could be driven from the pores. They would pile hot wool blankets on the sick. They would place hot bricks at their feet. They would feed them hot teas laced with powders to raise the fever higher. A famous mixture was Dover's powder. It contained ipecac to make you vomit, and another ingredient, something to dull the pain and create a dreamy hot flush: opium. Bleeding, purging, sweating. The doctor was looking for a reaction. He was looking for a crisis. They wanted to see the sweat, the vomit, the faintness from blood loss. To the heroic doctor, this collapse was not a symptom of the disease. It was proof that the cure was working. The medicine was winning the battle inside your body. Of course, this battle was often what killed the patient. The sickness weakened them, and the MT cure finished the job. Imagine your body trying to fight a fever and also trying to survive massive blood loss, and also trying to fight off mercury poisoning. You did not die of the disease. You died of the doctor. This philosophy gave the apothecary his true power. It turned his shop from a simple store into an arsenal. His shelves held the weapons for this heroic war, and those weapons were poisons. The very substances that lined his shelves: arsenic, mercury, and the most beloved and deadly of all, opium. Now we must quietly open the Victorian poison cabinet. The philosophy was an attack, and the weapons for that attack were stored on the apothecary's shelves. Let us now quietly push open the door to that poison cabinet. The air inside is dusty, still. It smells of bitter almonds and dried poppies. In the Victorian mind, the line between medicine and poison was dangerously thin. In fact, there was almost no line at all. A poison was simply a medicine given in the wrong dose, and a medicine
was just a poison that gave the right kind of reaction, the reaction they were looking for. Let us look at the three great substances of the era, the three dark miracles that filled every doctor's bag: mercury, arsenic, and opium. We begin with mercury. We have met its most famous form, calomel, a fine white powder, mercury chloride. The doctors adored it. It was their hammer, their hero's dose. They gave it for everything: a fever, a cough, a stomach ache, cholera. They even gave it to teething babies. Why? Because it produced a dramatic effect. And heroic medicine loved drama. A dose of calomel would make you salivate. Not just a little. It produced thick, heavy ropes of drool. You would drool for days. The doctors would measure the cure in pints of saliva. They saw this as proof. The body was expelling the poison. The sickness was pouring out of you. And then came the purging. The mercury would grip your bowels. It would cause violent cramping and explosive diarrhea. Again, proof. The disease was being scoured from your system. Of course, the patient grew weaker. They dehydrated. They trembled. But the doctor would nod wisely. The medicine was working. And if you survived the cure, the mercury stayed. It settled in your bones. Your teeth would loosen and fall out. Your hair would fall out. Your hands would develop a violent shake, the Mad Hatter's tremor. You would be cured of your fever, but you would be slowly rotting from mercury poisoning. That was the first pillar of the cabinet. Next to it on the shelf sits another white powder. It looks almost identical. This is arsenic. Today we know it as the perfect poison, tasteless, odorless, deadly. To the Victorians, it was also a health tonic. A tiny dose, a few grains, smaller than a grain of rice, would be mixed with sugar and water. It was sold as a general pick-me-up. It was said to give you energy, to give you a healthy glow. The most bizarre use was in beauty. Fashionable ladies wanted pale, luminous skin, so they would secretly buy complexion wafers. These were small white discs of chalk and starch laced with arsenic. You ate one a day.
The poison in tiny amounts would destroy red blood cells. It would make your skin look pale and waxy, almost translucent. It was the look of a delicate romantic illness. It was seen as the peak of beauty. Of course, the arsenic built up. It caused cramps, sickness, weakness. But these symptoms were just mistaken for feminine delicacy. The wafers were working. The line between looking fashionably ill and being fatally poisoned was a single extra wafer. But let us move past these violent minerals to the third bottle on the shelf. This one is not a powder. It is a liquid, a dark, thick, reddish-brown liquid. It is in a bottle with a simple label, laudanum. This is opium. If mercury was the doctor's hammer, opium was his blanket. It was the great comfort, the great panacea.
Laudanum was simple, powdered opium dissolved in pure alcohol, and it was everywhere. You could buy it from the apothecary. You could buy it from the grocer. You could buy it from the man who sold you vegetables. In the slums, it was cheaper than gin, cheaper than beer. It was the people's medicine. And what did it cure? The truth is, it cured nothing, but it made you feel as if it cured everything. Did you have a pain in your back from 16 hours of factory work? A spoonful of laudanum. Did you have a hacking cough from the coal dust in the air? A spoonful of laudanum. Did you have a deep sorrow, a melancholy, a fear of the world? A spoonful of laudanum. It stopped pain, it stopped coughs, it stopped diarrhea, but most of all, it stopped caring. It brought a warm, dreamy, listless escape. It was a chemical shelter from the cold, damp, brutal reality of Victorian life. And this is where we find its darkest use, the most common use of all, for babies.
A mother in a slum might have 6 children. She had to work, but her baby was crying, fussy, teething. She could not afford to stop working. So she would go to the apothecary and she would buy a small bottle, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, or Godfrey's cordial. The names were so gentle, so kind. But the main ingredient in all of them was opium. Molasses and alcohol and opium. She would put a few drops on the baby's gums, and the baby would stop crying. It would fall into a deep, deep sleep. It was not soothed, it was drugged. Mothers called it the quiet maker, and sometimes the dose was too much. The baby would just sleep and never wake up. Thousands of infants died this way. Accidental overdoses, wasting away because they were too drugged to eat. This was the Victorian medicine cabinet, a choice between a violent assault from mercury, a slow corruption from arsenic, or a deadly sleep from opium. The poisons were for the fevers, the coughs, the internal maladies. But the body has other failings. A leg crushed by a carriage wheel, a tumor growing hard and painful beneath the skin, a wound from a factory machine that refused to heal. For these things, the physician's potions were useless. You did not need a thinker. You needed a craftsman. You needed the surgeon. And he would not treat you in your home. He would take you to his place of work, a place known to medical students as the surgical theater.
The name sounds grand, but it was a place of profound terror. Let us picture it. We are in a university hospital. We walk up a steep spiral staircase. The air grows warmer. It smells strange, not of miasma or rot, but of sawdust, sweat, iron, and a faint chemical tang. We push open a heavy wooden door. We are not in a room. We are in an auditorium. Steep wooden benches rise up in a semicircle. They are packed with young men in dark suits, students. They are whispering, shuffling their feet. They are here to watch. They are the audience. And down below, in the center of the pit, is the stage. There is no velvet curtain. There is only one object under a bright skylight, a heavy wooden table. It is not white. It is stained, dark. It is scarred with countless cuts and grooves. The floor around it is covered in a thick layer of fresh sawdust to soak up what is to come.
Two porters in rough tunics wheel a wooden cart into the room. On it is the patient. It is you. Your heart is a drum. The faces of the students are a pale blur. You are awake. You are completely, terribly awake. There is no medicine for your fear. They lift you from the cart and place you on the table. The wood is hard against your back. They do not comfort you. They are efficient. They take thick leather straps and bind your arms, your chest, your healthy leg. You are pinned to the table. The door on the far side opens. The surgeon enters. He is the man we met before. He is not dressed in white. He wears his street clothes. His dark frock coat is stiff with the dried blood and pus of 100 other operations. He does not wash his hands. He looks up at the students and he nods. He is a showman. An assistant quietly places the tools on a small wooden stand. The sound of metal on wood. A long, thin knife. A brutal amputation saw. Thick, curved needles already threaded. The surgeon picks up the knife. He may test its sharpness against his thumb. He looks at you. This will be an amputation below the knee. He nods to the porters. They take their positions. One holds your shoulders. The other holds your hips. Their job is to pin you down when the screaming starts. And you will scream.
The surgeon looks to a student in the front row. The student pulls out a pocket watch. He holds it up. This is the most important part. Because in a world before anesthesia, a surgeon was not judged on precision. He was not judged on cleanliness. He was judged on speed. How fast could he get the job done? A good surgeon could take off a leg in under 30 seconds. A lifetime of agony compressed into half a minute. The student nods. The surgeon takes a breath. And he begins. The first thing you feel is not the cut. It is the pressure of the porters throwing their full weight on you. And then the theater erupts. Your own scream is so loud you cannot hear it. The students lean forward. The surgeon is a blur of motion. He does not pause. He does not hesitate. The knife drops. The saw is in his hand. The sound of it on your bone is a dry, rasping shriek. It is not just pain, it is a violation of reality. The surgeon's face is grim, splattered. He throws the saw down. Time! The student shouts, 28 seconds. A spatter of applause from the benches. The porters release you. You have already fainted from the shock. The severed leg is tossed with a thud into the bucket of sawdust. The surgeon takes the needle and begins to stitch. His work is done. He may rinse his hands in a small bowl of water, the water instantly turning dark red. He nods again to the students, and he leaves. You are unstrapped, wheeled out. You have survived the operation. But now the true test begins, because the surgeon's coat, his unwashed hands, his dirty tools, they have introduced a new killer. The ward fever, the gangrene, the sepsis, an infection that would creep into the wound and kill most of the patients who had survived the table. This was the Red Theater. The screams from these rooms were a normal sound in a hospital, a terror everyone knew and accepted, until a few doctors began to wonder, what if the patient did not need to be awake? What if there was a way to silence the screams, a way to bring on a chemical sleep? A strange new idea that smelled of ether and chloroform. The screams from the Red Theater were the soundtrack of the hospital, a sound of necessary terror. But a few doctors and chemists had begun to wonder. They were playing with strange new chemicals, gases and liquids that did not cure anything, but they could create a strange chemical escape. For years, they were just party tricks. Young medical students would hold laughing gas parties, inhaling nitrous oxide from silk bags. They would laugh hysterically, stumble and fall and feel no pain. And then one day, a dentist in America named Horace Wells watched one of these parties. He saw a man slam his leg into a wooden bench. His shin was bloody, but he did not stop laughing. He felt nothing. A light went on. What if this was more than a party? What if this was the end of pain? Wells tried it. He had his own tooth pulled while breathing the gas. He smiled and said he felt nothing.
But his first public demonstration was a disaster. The patient screamed, the students booed. Wells was disgraced. But the idea was loose. Another man, a dentist named William Morton, was looking for something stronger. He knew of another liquid, a chemical used for cleaning grime. It had a sweet, sharp, sickly smell. It was called ether. He practiced on his dog, on himself. Then, in 1846, in Boston, he arrived at a surgical theater, just like the one we visited. The benches were full, the surgeon was ready, the patient was terrified. Morton held a glass globe with a sponge inside. He placed it over the patient's mouth. Breathe deeply. The theater was silent. The patient's body went limp, his eyes closed. The surgeon leaned in. "Your patient is ready." The surgeon scoffed. He picked up his knife, and he made the first cut. There was no scream. There was no movement. The surgeon stopped. He looked at the audience, his face pale with shock. He continued the operation in terrible silence. When it was over, he turned to the crowd, and he said the words that changed the world. "Gentlemen, this is no humbug." The screams had been silenced. The ether dream was born.
The news spread across the ocean on steamships. It was a miracle. Surgeons in London and Paris read the reports with disbelief. No more straps, no more screaming. Just a quiet patient and a heavy, sweet sleep. They began to try it. The smell of ether began to fill the hospital wards. It was a strange smell. Heavy, sweet, chemical. Patients described the feeling. A roaring in the ears. A feeling of floating. A disconnection from the world. A dream state where they could see the operation but could not feel it. But ether was not perfect. It was volatile. The vapor was heavy and flammable. A single spark from a gas lamp in the theater could cause an explosion. It also made patients sick. They would vomit violently after waking. And it was slow. It could take 20 minutes of struggling and breathing to put a patient under. And then there was the resistance. Not everyone saw this as a miracle. Many of the oldest, most famous surgeons were horrified. They argued that pain was necessary. Pain, they said, was a vital sign. It told the surgeon what the body was feeling. To erase pain was to work blind. Other arguments were moral. They were religious. Pain was divine. God had willed it. They quoted the Bible, that in sorrow women shall bring forth children. To give a woman ether during childbirth was a sin. It was defying God's judgment. And some arguments were just pride.
The old surgeons liked the speed. Their entire reputation was built on that 30-second amputation. They saw anesthesia as weak, an unmanly new fad. A real surgeon, they said, operated on a conscious patient. The battle for sleep was not yet won. The doctors needed something better, something faster, something more pleasant, something that did not explode. The search led a doctor in Scotland named James Young Simpson to a different bottle, a heavy, sweet-smelling liquid, a solvent. Its name was chloroform.
Simpson was an obstetrician. He hated hearing the screams of women in labor. He wanted to find the perfect sleep. He began to experiment. The story is now legend. One evening in 1847, he gathered his 2 assistants in his dining room. They decided to test the chloroform. They sat around the table. Simpson poured a little of the liquid into a glass for each of them. They raised the glasses to their faces and inhaled. The effect was immediate. A sudden, bright, happy feeling. And then the entire group collapsed and fell unconscious under the table. Simpson woke up first. He realized he was on the floor. He saw his assistants snoring peacefully. And he knew in that instant that he had found it. Chloroform was a sensation. It was far more potent than ether. It worked in seconds, not minutes. It did not smell bad. It had a faint, sweet, fruity smell. And it was not flammable. It became the new drug of choice. But it was its most famous patient that sealed its victory, Queen Victoria. In 1853, she was giving birth to her 8th child. She hated the pain. She asked for Dr. John Snow to administer chloroform. The church was outraged, but the Queen did it. She called it that blessed chloroform. She woke up refreshed and happy. And with that single act, anesthesia became fashionable. It became respectable. The Red Theater grew quiet. But there was a dark side to this new sleep, a terrible, hidden danger. The dose. Ether was hard to overdose on. Chloroform was tragically easy. A little too much, and the patient's heart would simply stop. And the doctors did not know this. How did they give it? There was no machine, no vaporizer. They used the rag and bottle method. The doctor would simply pour the chloroform from the bottle onto a cloth or a handkerchief and hold it over the patient's face. How much was enough? How much was too much? They had no idea. They just watched the patient. And sometimes the patient would just drift deeper. Their breathing would grow shallow, and they would pass from sleep into death. It became a new kind of gamble, a choice between the certain terror of the knife or the unknown risk of a sleep so deep you might never return. The screams of men in surgery were silenced, but this new era of medicine had other terrors, especially for women. While their pain in childbirth was finally being eased, their minds and bodies were becoming the subject of a strange new diagnosis,
a medical tyranny whispered in dark rooms. The tyranny of hysteria.
The advent of anesthesia brought a new quiet to the hospital. The screams of men in the surgical theater had faded, but this new medical silence allowed other voices to be heard. Quieter voices. And the doctors now turned their attention away from the brutal mechanics of the body and toward the mysterious failings of the mind, especially the female mind. In the parlors and drawing rooms of every Victorian city, a silent epidemic was raging. It was not a fever. It was not a plague. It was a diagnosis, a word whispered by physicians, husbands, and fathers, a word that could explain everything. Hysteria. The word itself was ancient. It came from the Greek word hystera, meaning the womb. The ancient Greeks had believed that the womb was a separate animal, a creature living inside the woman. And if it became unhappy or light, it would wander. It would float up into the chest, pressing on the heart. It would rise into the throat, causing a feeling of choking. This ancient idea of a wandering womb still haunted the Victorian mind. Hysteria was not one illness. It was all of them. It was the doctor's great wastebasket diagnosis. Did a woman feel faint? It was hysteria. Did she feel anxious, sad, irritable? Hysteria. Did she have insomnia or sleep too much? Did she have shortness of breath, a feeling of tightness in her chest? Hysteria. Did she lack an appetite or have too much of one? Did she show too much emotion or not enough? Did she have strange ideas like wanting to read a dangerous book or even wanting to vote? It was all hysteria. The doctors saw it as an instability of the female nature, a weakness inherent to their sex. Women were seen as delicate, nervous. Their minds were as fragile as their bodies, and their wandering wombs were always ready to cause trouble. The woman herself was not to be blamed. Her own biology was betraying her. And since the illness was so common, the doctors developed cures. These cures were not meant to empower. They were meant to control, to force the woman and her wandering mind back into submission. And the most famous of these cures was not a medicine. It was a prison disguised as a prescription. It was called the rest cure.
The rest cure was perfected by a famous American physician, Dr. S. Weir Mitchell. He was the great expert on female nervousness. His cure was designed for women who were difficult, women who were artistic, intellectual, emotional. His goal was simple: complete and total infantilization. Let us imagine the treatment. You are a young woman diagnosed with hysteria. You are taken from your home. You are placed in a single room, usually in a private nursing home, and there you must stay for 6 to 8 weeks. The rules are absolute. You must not leave the bed.
You must not sit up. You must lie flat. You are forbidden to read. You are forbidden to write. You may not sew. You may not draw. You may not have any visitors. You are not allowed to speak or think about your worries. You are in total sensory deprivation. A nurse is with you at all times. She does everything for you. She bathes you. She brushes your hair. She turns you over in the bed. She reads to you, but only simple, boring children's stories. And then there is the food. This was the second part of the cure. Dr. Mitchell believed that hysteria was caused by a starved nervous system. His answer was to force-feed his patients. The nurse would bring you food, constantly. Gallons of milk, 4 or 5 quarts a day. Heavy beef broths, slabs of mutton, rich cream. You were to be fattened like a prized animal. If you refused to eat, the nurse would feed you herself. If you still refused, they would feed you with the tube. The goal was to break your will, to make you so bored, so listless, so dependent, that your hysterical personality would simply evaporate. You would become a passive, plump, obedient child again. The cure was a form of psychological torture delivered with a polite smile. This was the cure for the mind, but there was another cure, a cure for the body, for the womb itself.
The doctors believed that the womb could become congested. This congestion would build up, causing all the nervous symptoms. The womb needed to be relieved, and the medical term for this relief was a paroxysm, a hysterical paroxysm. We would call it an orgasm. The doctors saw this as a purely clinical procedure. It had nothing to do with pleasure. It was draining the system. So, women would go to the doctor's office for their treatment. The procedure was called pelvic massage. The woman would lie on a table. The doctor, or more often a trained midwife, would begin to manually massage the patient until the paroxysm was achieved. The symptoms of hysteria would magically disappear for a few weeks, and the patient would be told to return when her anxiety came back. This was a regular, normal medical treatment. But the doctors had a problem with it. It was boring. It was tiresome. It could take a long time. It made their hands cramp. Doctors complained about how much work it was. They needed a machine, something to do the work for them. The first attempts were steam-powered, large, clunky devices in spas that used jets of water. But then came a new invention, electricity. A clever physician in Britain named Joseph Mortimer Granville realized he could build a mechanical massager. He created a device with a motor. It was heavy, it was loud, and it worked beautifully. He called it his percussor. It could bring a patient to paroxysm in under 10 minutes. It was a medical marvel, the first electric vibrator. It was sold to doctors as a time-saving medical instrument. It was never meant for the home.
It was never meant for pleasure. It was a cure for a disease. But what happened when the hysteria was too deep? When the patient would not be cured by rest? When their mind was not just nervous, but truly broken? Then the doctor would sign a paper, and the family would call for a different kind of carriage, one that took you to a place of last resort, a place of high walls and locked doors, the terrifying world of the asylum.
The rest cure was for the delicate, the nervous. But what happened when the mind did not just bend? What happened when it broke? What happened when the hysteria was not quiet and poetic, but loud, violent, or completely lost? Then the physician would sign a paper. The family would turn away, and a different kind of carriage would be called, a carriage with no windows, with a lock on the outside of the door. It would take you on a long ride, away from the city center, to a new home, a place of high brick walls, a place of tall iron gates, a building so large and imposing it looked like a Gothic palace. You would hear the sound of a key, a heavy iron key in a massive lock. The door would open. The air inside would hit you. It was not the miasma of the street. It was not the perfume of the parlor. It was the smell of carbolic soap, of boiled laundry, of scrubbed pine floors. And beneath that clean, sharp smell, something else, a faint human sorrow. You had arrived at the asylum. The most famous of these in London was Bethlem Royal Hospital, but the people of the city had a different name for it, a name that had become a word for chaos itself: Bedlam. In the old days, Bedlam was a human zoo. The rich would pay a penny to walk through the holes and look at the mad in their cages. But the Victorians were more civilized. Their new asylums were not zoos. They were hospitals. They were built on a new kind of philosophy, a philosophy that sounded so kind. It was called moral treatment. But moral did not mean kindness. It meant discipline. The Victorian doctors believed that madness was a loss of self-control. The patient's sane will was buried deep inside, trapped by a new insane will. The asylum's job was not to heal. It was to break the insane will, to destroy it, and replace it with a new will, an obedient, quiet, and moral one. The asylum was a machine for rebuilding a human being.
The treatment began with routine, a rigid, unbreakable schedule. A bell would wake you before dawn, cold baths, simple, plain food, hours of hard physical labor, scrubbing floors, working in the laundry. There was no privacy, no personal possessions. You were a part of the machine. But what if the routine did not work? What if a patient was manic, violent, or locked in a deep melancholy? Then the moral treatment gave way to the physical cures. These were not medicine. They were shocks. The first was hydrotherapy.
This was not a gentle spa bath. The goal was to shock the system so violently that the brain would reset. Imagine a patient strapped into a wooden chair. A doctor would aim a high-pressure hose of ice-cold water directly at their head. The shock was so profound it could make the heart stop. Another version was the surprise bath. A patient would be told to walk across a normal-looking floor. A nurse would pull a lever. A trap door would open, and the patient would fall screaming into a hidden vat of ice water. This was medicine. If the water failed, they would move to the machines. The most terrifying was the spinning chair. It was a simple wooden chair, mounted on a heavy pivot with gears and a crank. The patient would be strapped in tightly, their head braced, and two strong attendants would begin to crank. The chair would spin, slowly at first, then faster and faster, 100 rotations a minute. The world would dissolve into a sickening, violent blur. The doctors would watch closely. They were waiting for one thing: vomiting. They believed that this was the madness leaving the body. Heroic medicine in the asylum. The patient would be spun until they fainted or were violently ill. Then they would be unstrapped, shaking, and cured.
And if the patient was simply violent and needed to be controlled, there was the strait waistcoat, a brutal suit of heavy canvas that bound the arms to the chest so tightly you could barely breathe. Or the padded room, a small, dark box, no windows. The walls, the floor, the door, all covered in thick padding. A room where you could not even find the sharp relief of injury. You were just left in the dark, in the silence, for days, until your insane will broke. This was the theory of the asylum. But the reality was often worse. The reality was not one-on-one treatment. It was overcrowding. These great Gothic buildings were designed for 500 patients. By 1860, they held 3,000. There were not enough doctors, not enough nurses. The cures were just punishments used by overworked staff. The asylum was not a hospital. It was a warehouse, a vast human storehouse for the people society did not want. The difficult wives, the strange sons, the elderly who were confused, the poor who had nowhere else to go. Most people who passed through those iron gates never left. They just sat in long, silent rows, staring at the walls. The rest cure, but for the rest of their lives. The doctors knew it was failing. These brutal physical shocks were not curing anyone. But the Victorian mind loved new technology. They had steam. They had chloroform. And now they had a new miracle force, a force they believed was the spark of life itself, electricity. And they began to wonder, if a body could be cured by an electric buzz, maybe a mind could be cured by it too. The age of the quack and his electric dream was about to begin.
The asylum was a place of brutal control, a machine for breaking the will. But the doctors were losing faith. The spinning chairs, the ice baths, the padded rooms, they were not curing anyone. They were just hiding the broken. The Victorian mind was restless. It was tired of these old, brutal methods. This was an age of invention. The telegraph key was clicking, sending messages through a wire across the sea. The steam engine was thundering across the countryside. The world was full of new and invisible forces, and the greatest of these was electricity. It was a mystery, a marvel, a clean, silent, modern miracle. Scientists in laboratories were making dead frogs' legs twitch with a spark. If electricity could move the dead, what could it do for the living? The doctors and the public began to wonder. Perhaps this was the answer. Perhaps sickness was not a miasma or an imbalance of humors. Perhaps sickness was simply a loss of energy, a loss of the body's vital spark. And if that was true, the cure was simple. You just had to put the spark back. This idea did not stay in the hospital. It exploded into the public imagination. It created a new kind of healer. This man was not the university physician. He was not the blood-stained surgeon. He was the professor, the inventor. He was the quack. And he sold his cures not in a quiet shop, but in the loud pages of the newspaper, in colorful posters, in miracle pamphlets. He promised something new. He did not promise a violent purge. He did not promise bleeding or vomiting. His cure was gentle. It was modern. It was electric. The golden age of quackery began, and its greatest product was the electric belt. Let us picture one. You would see the advertisement in your newspaper. Are you weak? Are you nervous? Do you suffer from sluggish digestion? From loss of vigor? Restore your manhood. Restore your vital spark. You would send away your money in the post. A week later, a discreet package would arrive. Inside, a handsome leather belt.
It looked normal, but sewn into the lining were a series of small metal discs, zinc and copper. You would buckle this belt tightly against your bare skin, and then you would wait. As your day went on, your own sweat, the moisture and salt from your body, would create a chemical reaction between the two different metals. It was a tiny, tiny battery. And after an hour, you would feel it. A faint tingle, a strange buzzing sensation against your skin. A tiny electric pulse. This was proof. The belt was working. The electricity was flowing into you. It was recharging your vital organs, your nerves, your spine. You were being cured. It was sold for everything. Impotence, constipation, rheumatism, a nervous stomach. It was a miracle machine. And the idea spread. If a belt could cure a man's vigor, what else could electricity do?
For the ladies, there were electric corsets. The same metal discs were now sewn directly into the whale-bone stays. The advertisements promised it would cure hysteria. It would calm the nerves, and as a side effect, it would improve the figure by magnetically attracting the flesh into a more pleasing shape. The market was flooded. There were magnetic hair brushes. The bristles were just cheap wire, but the handle held a magnet. You were to brush your hair 100 times before bed. This would align the magnetic forces of the brain. It would cure baldness. It would cure headaches. It would cure melancholy. There were electric rings for your fingers to cure arthritis. Electric insoles for your shoes to draw the sickness out of your feet. Did any of it work? Of course not. The electric current was so weak it could not penetrate the skin. The buzz was just a chemical reaction, a surface vibration. It was the idea of the cure that people loved. It was the feeling of doing something modern, something scientific. And most importantly, it was gentle. It was the complete opposite of heroic medicine. It did not bleed you. It did not poison you. It did not lock you in a spinning chair. It just buzzed. This powerful desire for a gentle cure, a cure that was natural, was not just limited to electricity. The Victorians began to look for other natural forces, and they found one, a force as old as the earth itself, a substance that promised to wash away the sickness, to purify the body from the inside out. This new craze was hydropathy, the water cure. And it was just as strange and just as brutal as anything that came before.
The electric belt was a harmless fraud, a gentle buzz. It was the idea of a cure without violence, and this idea was powerful. The Victorian mind was growing tired of mercury and lancets. They longed for something pure. They began to reject the apothecary's poisons and the surgeon's knife. They wanted a cure that came not from a bottle, but from nature. And what is more natural, more pure than water? This single idea sparked a massive new craze. It was called hydropathy, the water cure. It was started by a Silesian farmer named Vincenz Preisnitz. He claimed he had cured his own broken ribs as a boy by watching a wounded deer bathe itself in a cold stream. He believed that cold water was nature's hidden medicine, that it could wash away disease. This simple folk idea electrified the wealthy classes. This was the answer. Not poison, not electricity, just cold, clean water. Grand hotels began to be built, not in the cities. The cities were full of miasma and rot. These new hydropathic institutes were built like palaces in isolated, beautiful countryside. In the mountains, by pure natural springs. The rich and the sick flocked to them. Charles Darwin went. Florence Nightingale went. They arrived at these grand spas weary of their illnesses. They checked into elegant rooms. They were surrounded by beautiful gardens. They were ready for their gentle natural cure. They had no idea what was waiting for them, because the water cure was not gentle. It was not kind. It was just heroic medicine disguised as a spa day. It was just as brutal as the spinning chair. And the treatment began before dawn. At 4 o'clock in the morning, a loud knock on your door. You are not woken gently. A spa attendant, an attendant of the bath, enters your dark room. He carries no warm tea. He carries a pile of coarse linen sheets. They are soaking wet. They are dripping with ice-cold spring water. This is your first treatment, the wet sheet pack. You're told to stand. The attendant takes the first ice-cold sheet and wraps it around you tightly. The shock of the cold makes you gasp. Your heart hammers. He takes another and another. He wraps you from your neck to your feet, like a mummy. You are bound so tightly you cannot move your arms. Then he lifts you and places you back in your bed. He piles thick wool blankets on top of you, and then he leaves. He locks the door from the outside. You are alone, in the dark, bound, freezing. The goal was to create a crisis. The body would be forced to fight the cold. After 10 minutes, the freezing turns to a prickling heat. After 20 minutes, you are burning. You begin to sweat profusely, trapped inside your wet linen cocoon. The attendants called this the reaction. The body was cooking the disease out. You would be left like this for 2 or 3 hours. Many patients panicked. They felt they were being buried alive. They would scream, but the doors were thick. This was just the beginning. After your cooking, the attendant would return. He would unwrap you. You are now steaming, drenched in sweat. But you are not done. You are rushed down a cold hallway to the bathroom. This room is not a a gentle, warm bath. It is a tiled chamber. The attendant stands behind a complex settle-full pipes and nozzles. This is the douche. He aims a metal nozzle at you and fires a high-pressure jet of ice-cold water. It hits you like a fist. He moves the jet up and down your spine, your chest, your legs. It is so cold, it burns. The shock is meant to excite the nerves. You might be put in a sitz bath, a small tub where only your hips are submerged in freezing water for 30 minutes. Or given Neptune's girdle, a cold, wet bandage wrapped around your waist to be worn all day under your clothes. And then there was the drinking, the second part of the cure. You were forced to drink and drink and drink. 10, 12, 15 glasses of cold spring water every single day. You were to be flushed out from the inside. Your body bloated, your mind foggy. You were just drowning slowly. This was the cure, a daily ritual of shock and endurance, a battle against cold and wet. And people loved it because it felt like something was happening. It felt natural, and it was not poison. They had just traded the tyranny of mercury for the tyranny of water. They were still attacking the body, still searching for a violent crisis. This obsession with water as a pure cure was about to meet a terrible irony. Because in the teeming cities not far from these spas, a new terror was arriving. A disease so fast, so violent, it made hysteria look tame. A blue death that could kill you in hours. The disease was cholera, and the terrible secret, the secret that would finally change medicine forever, was that the killer was in the water. The hydropathic institutes offered a fantasy, a world where pure, clean water could wash away all disease. But back in the teeming cities, that fantasy was about to shatter. In the crowded, filthy slums of London and Paris, a new terror was arriving. It came suddenly. It came from the east, and it was worse than any fever or hysteria they had ever known. It was a disease so fast, so complete, it seemed supernatural. They called it the Blue Death, cholera. Imagine a perfectly healthy man, a dock worker. He wakes up, he eats his breakfast, he goes to work. At noon, he feels a sudden cramp, a wave of sickness that turns his stomach to water. By 2 o'clock, he is collapsing. His body is purging itself of all liquid, violently, completely. By 4 o'clock, he is unrecognizable. His skin has turned a strange grayish blue. It is cold to the touch. His face is gaunt, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. He looks like a corpse that is still breathing. By 6 o'clock, he is dead. This was cholera. It could kill you in hours, and it arrived in terrifying waves. The city would be normal on a Tuesday, and by Friday, the church bells would be tolling without pause. The thump of hammers building cheap coffins would be the only sound in the street. The doctors were useless. They were terrified. They fell back on their old beliefs. It is the miasma. A great cloud of cholera poison, they said, has drifted over the city. It is in the air. If you smell the river, you will get it. If you pass a sewer grate, you will get it. They told people to burn tar in the streets, to fire cannons, to break up the poisoned air. They told people to flee to the countryside. But the Blue Death just kept coming. The heroic doctors tried their cures. They bled the patients. The blood that came out was thick and black like tar. They gave them calomel. The mercury only worsened the purging. They gave them opium. Nothing worked. The disease just burned through the slums like a fire in a dry field. And in the middle of this panic, in the heart of London's Soho district, in the terrible outbreak of 1854, there was one man, a quiet doctor. He watched the chaos, and he did not believe. His name was John Snow.
John Snow was not like the other doctors. He was not a heroic physician. He was a skeptic, a scientist, a man of logic. He had already made his name as an anesthetist. He was the man who had given Queen Victoria that blessed chloroform. He was a man who believed in evidence. And when the cholera outbreak hit Soho, he walked into the heart of it. The miasma theory did not make sense to him. If the poison was in the air, why was it not everywhere? Why would one man in a house die, while his neighbor in the same building, sharing the same air, remained perfectly healthy? It did not add up, so he began to do something no doctor had done before. He did not look at the sky. He did not consult the ancient texts. He began to count. He walked the streets of Soho. The smell of death and carbolic acid was everywhere. Carts piled with the dead rattled over the cobblestones, and John Snow just walked, with a notebook. He went door to door. He asked a simple question: "Who has died here?" And then he asked a second question, a question that must have seemed strange. "Where do you get your water?" He began to draw a map of the neighborhood, every street, every house, every alley, and for every person who had died of cholera, he made a small black mark, a dot on the map. In the first 10 days, there were 500 black marks. The map became a terrifying picture. The deaths were not a cloud. They were not random. The black marks were clustering. They were all huddled together around one single point. The black dots on his map formed a tight, dark circle. And in the exact center of that circle was not a sewer, not a graveyard. It was a public water pump. a pump on Broad Street, a pump that was famous. The people of Soho loved this pump. They said its water was colder, that it tasted better than any other pump in the neighborhood. People would walk past other pumps just to get their water from Broad Street. Snow looked at his map. The evidence was overwhelming. And then he found the exceptions, the anomalies that proved his theory. There was a large workhouse, a prison for the poor, right in the middle of the outbreak. But the black dots stopped at its wall. No one inside was getting sick. Snow went inside. He asked, "Where do you get your water?" The master of the workhouse pointed. "We have our own well. We do not use the Broad Street pump." Another anomaly. A brewery, right on the same street. The men there worked all day. None of them were sick. Snow asked. The owner laughed. "Water? My men don't drink water. They get an allowance of beer." The case was sealed. John Snow took his map and his evidence to the local authorities. He told them, "The killer is not in the air. It is in the water from this pump." The parish officials thought he was mad. They looked at the water. It was clear. It did not smell. It was pure. But Snow was relentless. And finally, to quiet him, they agreed to a simple act. They went to the Broad Street pump, and they removed the handle, just in case. The pump was broken, and within a few days the cholera outbreak in Soho just stopped. Later, they dug under the pump. They found that the well was only 3 feet away from an old leaking cesspit from a nearby house. A cesspit that had been filled with the waste from the very first cholera patient. The pure water was poison. John Snow had proven it. He had saved hundreds, but he had also raised a terrible new question. The authorities still did not believe him. They called it a coincidence, because Snow could not answer one final question. If the killer was in the water, what was it? What thing invisible to the eye could be so deadly? He had stopped the killer, but he did not know its name. The world was not haunted by miasma. It was haunted by something new, an invisible enemy, an army of tiny germs, and the final battle of Victorian medicine was about to be fought against the doctors themselves.
John Snow had proven how cholera spread. He had stopped an outbreak by removing a pump handle. He had shown the world that the killer was in the water. But the medical world was not convinced. The physicians and the government officials still clung to their old belief, the miasma. They called Snow's findings a coincidence. Why? because Snow could not answer one vital question. What exactly was in the water? He proposed it was a thing, a tiny living organism. But when they looked at the Broad Street water under a microscope, they saw nothing. The water looked clean. The idea of an invisible enemy was too much. It sounded like magic. It sounded like superstition. Doctors believed in what they could see, what they could smell. And so the miasma theory continued to rule. While John Snow's discovery sat on a shelf collecting dust, another man across the channel in France was looking at a different problem. He was not a doctor. He was a chemist. His name was Louis Pasteur. He was hired by the French wine industry. Their wine was going sour. They were losing millions. Pasteur put the sour wine under his microscope, and he saw them. In the good wine, he saw tiny round organisms, yeast. In the sour wine, he saw different organisms, tiny rod-shaped invaders. He realized that these invaders were eating the wine and producing acid. They were not a result of the souring. They were the cause. He called them germs. He proved that if you heated the wine just enough, you could kill these germs without ruining the flavor. The process was pasteurization. He had saved the wine. But his mind went further. If these tiny germs could make wine sick, what if they could make people sick? What if all these diseases, cholera, typhoid fever, were not miasmas in the air, but tiny invisible invaders? He published his germ theory, and the medical world laughed at him. They called him a mere chemist. What did he know of the human body? They clung to their miasma, to their spontaneous generation. The truth was sitting right in front of them, but they refused to see it. The theory needed a champion. It needed someone inside the hospital. That champion was a Scottish surgeon named Joseph Lister. Lister was a good surgeon. He was not fast and brutal like the old heroic doctors. He was quiet, gentle, precise. Anesthesia had allowed him to be, but something haunted him. He called it ward fever. He would perform a perfect operation, an amputation. The patient would be fine. And then 3 days later, the smell would begin. The wound would turn black. The pus would appear. The fever would spike. And the patient would die. He knew it was not the surgery. It was something after. He calculated that in his amputation ward, half of all patients died from this infection. He was a man in despair. Then he read Pasteur's work. He read about the germs, and everything clicked. The miasma was not the problem. The germs were. But where were they coming from? He realized with a creeping horror, the germs were coming from him, from his own unwashed hands, from his bloody frock coat, from the air of the hospital itself. He realized that he was the one killing his patients. He needed a way to kill the germs. He had heard that a chemical called carbolic acid
was being used to clean sewers, to stop the miasma smell. Lister thought if it could clean a sewer, maybe it could clean a wound. In 1865, a young boy was brought to him. His leg was horribly broken, a compound fracture. The bone had snapped and torn through the skin. This was a death sentence. Infection was guaranteed. Lister decided to try his new idea. He set the bone, and then he took a cloth soaked in carbolic acid, and he covered the wound. He bandaged it clean. He waited. The boy did not get a fever. The smell of rot never came. The wound healed cleanly. The boy lived. Lister had just invented antiseptic surgery. He thought the world would cheer. He thought he had saved them. Instead, the medical world attacked him. They were insulted. He presented his findings. He told them, "Gentlemen, we must wash our hands before we operate." And they booed him. They were gentlemen. A gentleman's hands were clean. To suggest that their hands carried invisible filth was a mortal offense. They mocked his carbolic acid. It was messy. It burned the skin. They hated the extra time it took. They wanted to be fast, to be heroic. Lister's antisepsis was fussy. It was slow. For decades, the war raged. The germ theory versus the miasma. The old doctors versus the new. The heroic physicians versus the scientists. But the evidence could not be stopped. Slowly, one by one, hospitals that adopted Lister's methods saw their death rates plummet. The ward fever vanished. Mothers in childbirth stopped dying in droves. The Red Theater was not only silent, it was now clean. The old world was over. The miasma finally blew away. The Victorian era of medicine, which began with a smell, ended with an invisible truth. The spinning chairs, the poison cabinet, the brutal table, they all faded. They became the strange, dark artifacts of an age of heroic error. A time when doctors were guided by fear and tradition, not by evidence. An age of terror that finally and slowly gave way to the quiet light of reason. And now the clinic is quiet. The last battle has been fought. The miasma is gone. The air is finally clear. And you can rest. You can drift into that blessed chloroform sleep, knowing that the Red Theater is closed forever. If this journey through history's shadows has brought you some quiet, consider subscribing. Your presence here is always a comfort. Good night.